Go ahead and tell me your name and why we're interviewing you.
Name is Bob Gurr. I'm being interviewed for the purposes of telling stories about Aero Development in Mountain View, primarily their early history, so that people can really understand the significance of Aero Development and the town of Mountain View. When I was working at Disney, that was called WED Enterprises, was the part of the company that was designing Disneyland. None of us had titles, so I called myself the Director of Special Vehicle Development. I didn't start in the amusement industry. I started in the automotive industry because I wanted to design cars, car bodies, styling, and went to Art Center College of Design, General Motors Scholarship, got hired by the Ford Motor Company, spent 5 months in Detroit, saw it was a dead-end job, returned to California, created a company called R.H. Gurr Industrial Design, did that for a year and a half, and then one day Walt Disney called. How and when did you first hear about Aero? Soon after I started the work at WED Enterprises for Disneyland, it became obvious we were going to build a number of attractions. I was focused mostly on the Autopia car, which was a local independent project, but within a day or so I saw an attraction that was called Peter Pan, and this Peter Pan was a boat hanging from an overhead trolley, and there was a company that had something to do with it called Aero Development. At the same time, I noticed there was going to be other attractions that which we call flat floor dark rides. One of them was Mr. Toad's Wild Ride. And there were going to be some little cars. They weren't there yet. But at some point in time, those were the first ride vehicles that ever showed up at Disneyland. And that's when I learned there was an Aero Development, was the company that was designing, building those cars, and it would install the track and the cars by the opening day of Disneyland. And you worked alongside Bacon and Morgan, correct? I didn't directly work alongside Carl and Ed at Aero Development. I worked in the machine shop at the Disney studio. My immediate superior was the manager of the machine shop, Roger Brogy Sr. He in turn would work with all the outside vendors that we would be working with. One of those outside vendors, that was the most prominent one, was Aero Development, up in Mountain View while we were down in Burbank. Roger would do all of the business discussions with Carl and Ed up at Aero Development while I was primarily doing the technical interface between what they were doing and what we were doing down at the machine shop in Burbank. Talk to me about your visits to the Aero Garage. They started off with an interesting flight usually with Walt's plane, correct? We first started to visit Aero using commercial aircraft until Walt bought his own airplane, which was a green and white Beechcraft Model 80 Queen Air, which in those days we only had to have a single pilot, and since I was a pilot, a glider pilot, our corporate pilot loved to have me ride with him and act as a co-pilot, in addition to being one of the engineers, along with a cabin full of other engineers, coming up to San Jose Airport for the purpose of going to Aero and spending a day with him. We would spend a day covering all of the technical issues, some of the business issues, so we never stayed overnight. It was always we got up here quick enough, we could do all the work, get in the airplane and go back home again. How often did you visit the Aero Garage up here? Not just the garage here, but the one over off of Plymouth. I don't think we had regular visits. It's whenever they were far enough along in a ride attraction that we wanted to now, say, approve some of the design, or we'd come up here when they were testing, like let's say the Flume Ride. They'd say, okay, we got it working. We'd come up here in our suits and they'd put us in the boat and go down, and we come off soaking wet with our suits ruined, and Carl and Ed saying, well, that's we're still making adjustments, you know, it is a new attraction. You are responsible for working on designing the Matterhorn Bobsleds. It's one of the many signature attractions that you've worked on. Talk about how you didn't necessarily A, like coasters, and B, have the knowledge to start with to even design the thing. Well, the Matterhorn was a curious project from the standpoint that I didn't like roller coasters one bit, but Walt told me I'm going to design both the preliminary shape of the car, and I'm going to also design the course line for the track. While the decision had been made with Carl and Ed at Aero Development up here in Mountain View, that they were to manufacture whatever we came up with, and that included the body of the car, and also the track course. Now the body of the car was interesting from the standpoint, it's a typical bobsled where people sit straddle style. And if you recall, the early one had a cockpit with 2x2 people, so that way I called that date night seating, because your girlfriend would sit in the front and then you'd sit behind. It's an extremely efficient way to seat passengers in that type of a vehicle. Now I designed the shape of the car, but Aero was going to design and engineer the chassis of the car because that had to interface with the design of the track structure that they were going to do. Now, in those days, Walt would set a date that we're going to open an attraction before we start designing it. That meant the time frame was already well understood, so you knew how fast you were going to have to go. So Aero came up with the idea of use simple steel pipe and then bend the pipe to the shape, because that was going to be faster than wood and steel plate, which is the way normally they're done. But at no time were we inventing the steel coaster track, which we accidentally invented, but that was only because of time constraint, not simply inventing something. Well, there's no pipe benders of that type that could bend the pipe, so they stopped and invented a pipe bender. It was a very strange thing that was a claw that had like a cylinder on it, and if you grab the pipe, you can bend the pipe, but to create the twisting course, you could twist the pipe as you were squeezing it. And you go along and squeeze it every couple of inches and do it mostly by eye, trying to get it to fit a pattern. These guys were so inventive, they could see quick and easy ways to do things. So they built the entire track in sections at Mountain View, and then would ship it down to Anaheim. And as each section of the track came in, we just simply installed it and welded it all together. Now it's a very rough track. It's not designed by computer, which all roller coasters have been designed since by computer. And it doesn't use what we call a heartline course path, where when you make a turn one way or the other, the track actually rotates around a line passing through your heart. So the track, to make a right turn, would swing to the left and make its bank. We simply use the top of the track as the course line, which meant as you enter a turn, the track, say, turns left, but that means the car and your body is suddenly thrown to the left, which makes it an extremely rough ride. But none of us knew that eventually heartline course line was the correct one. But as far as I was concerned, course line being top of pipe was the simplest reference of all. So that's what we did. In school, you were forced to learn mathematics, and some of it's dull, but I got an A in algebra. The very next class was Geometry 1. I got an F and a pass. And the instructor said, "I don't want to see you again." I was that bad. But Geometry 1 is a basis for so much design configurations. Not until 1958 did I find that I needed trigonometry, because there's endless calculations that were required to do a roller coaster track. So I found a little booklet that had the description of geometry. It's nothing but the relationship of a circle to a triangle with all the different sides and with Latin names, with angles, and they all have a relationship, and they're all in a chart, in chart form, reasonably close enough to be accurate, where to do it really accurate you need a calculator of some kind. Nowadays, every computer will do it for you. So I had to look at that and figure out how to do this, and I found in 15 minutes the essence of trigonometry. You could teach it to yourself in about 15 minutes, so bang, I had the tool I needed and I could get started doing the calculations to design the track.
There's been a lot of stories that have gone around about the first Matterhorn test run. End all the confusion now. Tell us what really happened and who really was the first person to go down that track.
Well, actually, in point of history, I was the first person to get on the track because as we were installing the track, we had about 3/4 of it done at some point. Now we wanted to test it. We'd been putting sandbags in the car, cycling it many, many times. And I was there one morning with my little boy, and my boss, Roger Broggie Sr., said, "Robert, you design it, you ride it." Out comes the sandbags, and my little boy and I jump in the car, and we go up the chain hoist, take a trip around, and come back down to the end. The car behaved exactly the same as the sandbag, but as kind of a joke, some of the men that were at the bottom of the track said, "We got Gurr right where we want him. Let's pull the hay bales away, let the car run off the track." But they didn't, but you still have to hand grab the car to stop it anyway. Right after that, within a couple of days, we added more track, and that's where various executives of the company also wanted to go for a ride in it. And I believe each one would rightly want to brag that they had the first ride, but they only remember their first ride. I was the real first ride.
Moving on to a bit more of a very beloved and mysterious Aero thing, the flying saucers. You did a lot of work on that. Didn't necessarily work out as much as they wanted it to.
The flying saucer attraction was probably the most beloved, and it didn't last too many years because it was technically difficult because it was way ahead of its time. Now, it had two parts. It had a vehicle, which was very simple, and then it had this very complicated floor deck that underneath it was a series of air chambers that would allow air to go from these chambers through holes to support the bottom of the flying saucer when it would pass over the openings, and the valves would close with a certain closure rate. Carl Bacon was the inventor of that. It was the simplest doggone thing, not a very complex thing, but they had to make them by the thousands. Now the car was completely simple. It was one of my favorite designs because I did the styling of it. It's a car with no moving parts. Nothing can break. I was delighted to have designed the flying saucer, and still today that flying saucer is patented to me by the U.S. Patent Office. So I proudly can to say that the United States government recognizes me as a flying saucer inventor.
Tell us a little bit about, we're just going to go through some of the Aero rides that you collaborated with. Casey Jr.
The Casey Jr. attraction was a cute, simple little what would be like a dark ride, except it's outside going up and down hills. That was a concept that was done at the Disney studio by one of the animators. And since Aero Development had done small kiddie car type of railroad cars, they made an adaptation of some of their previous designs, but modified it so it would go up and down hills. And you remember there's something about Casey Jr. had the idea of the impossible hill. Well, in testing, it went up the hill and it tipped over backwards and went down the hill. So that was one of the first times I noticed that attraction. I was asked to go over and help design something to prevent it from going down the hill backwards. Who designed this? Oh, it was a company called Aero Development. So that was my first inkling that not all their things were going to be perfect.
Let's talk about a piece that you still have in your house, prominently displayed, Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, the only ride on Earth you can go to hell.
Of the early attractions at Disneyland, which we call flat floor dark rides, Mr. Toad's Wild Ride is a typical example of that because it's very common. And of course, Disney used the story of Mr. Toad, so it was very logical for Walt to ask Aero Development to design and build a car for this little Mr. Toad dark ride. Actually, they used a stock chassis they already had, but just restyled the body and the seating to look like Mr. Toad. So Walt ordered 12 of those little cars, all handmade, all hand pounded out of metal, personally by Carl and Ed, without any tooling. And every car was slightly different. Years ago, when they removed those cars and replaced them at Disneyland with fiberglass cars, some of the cars were sent around to various parts of the company. A couple of executives had some, and I had two of them, sold one. So still today in my house, I have Winky, a little red car, and I get up in the morning and I look at Winky and I says, Winky, do you remember that opening day? Because it's such a remembrance of what it was like opening Disneyland. And I have this precious artifact, which was built just right down the street from where we're speaking, have one of those precious cars today.
Okay, we're going to go through the other ones. Just if you had work on them or significant work, it's great. If not, it's no big deal. Alice in Wonderland.
On the Alice in Wonderland attraction, Aero did the vehicles again like the Mr. Toad attraction, but we now had a much more complicated show with action equipment, which we call show action equipment. Now in the Mr. Toad attraction, these were all kind of one-of-a-kind, kind of goofy things. But in the Alice ride, I wanted to make them all be uniform as far as, let's say, the valves, bearings, type of control. So in other words, it's much more predictable for service reasons. So while Aero did the cars, I didn't have anything to do with the cars, but I was the principal designer for all the show action equipment in the original years of that attraction.
Snow White?
Snow White was yet another dark ride. That was one that didn't have any trouble running it. Very simple actions because it's mostly painted flats. The only show action equipment was a bunch of fishing lines dangling like spider webs that would make the girls scream, and they required no maintenance of any kind. So there was very little I ever had to do on that attraction.
Let's talk about some of your the real passion, which is automobiles, the Autopia and the midget Autopia.
We had original Autopia ride. We had 2 tracks with the car that I designed the body and of course the chassis. And shortly after the Autopia was put into action, we needed even more Autopia. So we added an Autopia Junior, which was another track, which was strictly temporary, in which the little tiny kids could drive it. So we outfitted the foot pedal with a block of wood so the little short kids could actually drive that car. Then we needed still more attractions, so the little tiny midget Autopia was installed, was there for a number of years. And rather than a custom car made just for Walt Disney, that was a completely stock Aero Development car. That was one of their standard products. Now what was interesting was Walt always wanted rides custom built just for him, but in that case he made an exception because Aero Development did have a very reliable and very simple little car ride, so we just took one of theirs and installed it.
Talk a little bit about the motorboat cruise.
The Disneyland originally opened with a what we would call a motorboat cruise. It was called the Phantom boats. These Phantom boats were spectacular looking. Bruce Bushman, a Disney artist, designed them. Had these big fins on the back, but it was the dumbest business plan I've ever seen. You had one cast member who is on the payroll driving 2 little kids. The ratio of cast member to kids is extremely poor. So in addition, the boat had an air-cooled motor inside a closed engine room, and these engines would overheat to the point they would just simply burn up. So that was taken out, and by 1959 we put in a motorboat cruise. That was a boat just about as dumb because Admiral Fowler wanted a propeller in the front of the boat pulling the boat through the attraction, which had a guide with underwater pipes that it would travel through. It was a tricky boat to design and engineer because I had to build it backwards and put a V-boat drive with the motor facing one way going into a V drive that then went down through a shaft log out the nose of the boat with the propeller out in the front. The steering was very awkward. There was something about all kinds of torque reaction, and that attraction died a natural death after a few years.
Talk a little bit about It's a Small World, and obviously started at the World's Fair and then how it got to Disneyland.
Of the 4 different attractions that Walt was working on for the New York World's Fair, the Ford Motor Company one started very early, like in 1961, but we got all the way to 1963, about summer '63, when it was decided, well, we're going to build the Small World attraction, which meant it started hopelessly late. all of us were busy on all of the different attractions, so Walt immediately had me take a look at how would we do a boat, how would it be arranged, how would a water trough work. So I came up with the basic guiding of the boat, where we had a trough with a drop channel in it, because I wanted to see horizontal wheels not on the side of a boat. I want to see them at the bottom of the trough. Carl and Ed Morgan at Aero Development immediately saw that they could use a pump system and use the wheels as sort of like a water catcher in this little transfer pump arrangement in the little bottom trough. And so that was the configuration for the New York World's Fair. That track was built by Aero Development, the whole guide system, propulsion system. Then at the end of the fair in '65, we brought all that track back to Disneyland, installed it, and that original track remained in service until about 4 or 5 years ago at Disneyland. So it ran over 42 years in its original design.
All right. Were you involved with Dumbo or Mad Tea Party at all?
Dumbo was another one of those cute little attractions that Aero Development designed. In its original configuration, it was our most troublesome ride because it was used hydraulics. But unfortunately, the type of hydraulics was sort of like used military equipment, which was very, very problematic. And one of the features I remember about that attraction was every morning the mechanics were slipping and sliding and falling down, and all the oil that had spilled on the operating base from it. So it took a number of years to get that work well. And at some point, one of the elephants fell off, suffered a structural failure. So I was asked to go take a look and see the source of the structural failure. And of course, it was a bit of a design failure. So I did a redesign of Aero's original framework for the inside of the Dumbo. Now, the way we worked with Aero, they were happy that if something didn't work and we discovered it, and then we would figure out how to improve it or fix it, they were happy to bid on doing the repair, because yes, it's their original design, they had a fault, but we were the ones paying for the design change, and they were getting paid for the repairs. Everybody's happy.
Talk a little bit about Pirates of the Caribbean.
Pirates of the Caribbean is the one attraction I wish I had been invited to help with. It was a complex, thorough storytelling attraction, the last one that Walt personally worked on, and that's why it's the premier attraction in the entire world for all theme parks, because it had the thoroughness of the way Walt wanted to do things. That was his ride.
Adventure Through Inner Space and the Haunted Mansion, specifically those little OmniMovers.
Right. The Monsanto attraction was probably one of my kind of secret favorites, because we were looking at ways to improve attraction design and storytelling right after the New York World's Fair. And I was sitting in John Hench's office. He was like our lead Imagineer, and just a casual conversation about what might we do next. And I was quite aware that we had a lot of rides at the New York World's Fair that were a chain of vehicles. In other words, an endless chain, which has certain advantages. The whole machine runs continuously, and you can't have one car hit another car. But the car would be on a chassis, so you just saw what you saw. And I thought, John had a candied apple on a stick on his desk, and I just casually picked up this apple, and I said, well, John, you know, we can have a chassis on a track, and the track can go up and down and turn right and left, and we'll put a post on the chassis, and the people will be in this little pod, and I can turn them right and left, and I can tip them up and down independent of the chassis, and that way we can direct the guest's vision into the scene, so it's like a proper movie. And I said, yeah, it'll move in all directions, so yeah, it's a mover. And then I said, well, you know, I'm a pilot, and there's a thing called an Omni range, which is a radio navigational aid, and Omni means all around, so it's OmniMover. So in the first conversation, within a few minutes, the configuration was described, and it accidentally got its permanent name. That's how fast ideas will develop. And at that same time, Monsanto was inquiring about wanting to participate in some kind of an attraction, and also at that same time, in parallel with that, the idea of an attraction where you look at an atom. You had to shrink yourself down to an atom. So all those ideas went together very, very quickly that, oh, well, we have this attraction where we can point the people to all the scenes. Now the scenic designer says, oh, now we can really do the scenes really, really neat. So all that whole job went together very, very fast. But in the meantime, for about 10 years, there was a team working on the Haunted Mansion as a string of gags that you'd walk through and look at. Walkthroughs, you can't control the pacing or the time or anything. Those guys got wind of our OmniMover from Monsanto and said, well, we want one of those too, because that'll solve our problem. So while people today will look at the Haunted Mansion as the first of the OmniMover, no, the OmniMover came first in the Monsanto attraction and was immediately put to work to solve the problem of a Haunted Mansion attraction.
Out of all the Aero projects you've worked on with Disney, which one is your favorite, or which one stands out the most? I mean, you did 200, you said, total projects at least?
About 250 jobs is what I did in my total career, both in Disney and also after Disney. The parts that we did with Aero Development, some of them were little repair jobs, some were original configurations. But the one that I'm most proud of is to be asked to invent a roller coaster track course, which is a highly technical thing, has nothing to do with automobile styling, which was my first love of design. And the fact that I didn't have the mathematical knowledge to do it, but found the knowledge right away. So what that meant was I was handed a large, technical, expensive job, not being prepared for it, but within a matter of a day or two, I got myself prepared and away we went on it. And it worked. So that's got to be my favorite.
And that became the Matterhorn, right?
That became the Matterhorn as the final name of it. We actually called it Snow Mountain when it started, and then the name Matterhorn got applied partway through the project. It was always a joy to come up to Aero Development because we were going to have a nice day of conversation with Carl and Ed. Now these guys were very, very informal, no ties. They were very, very polite. I just, somebody you really like to hang with. And Ed in particular there was an interesting characteristic. He always wore a plaid flannel shirt, and which had flat pockets on it. And I usually wore something a little bit similar. And I was always in the habit of cleaning my glasses by taking them off and using the flat pocket to clean them. And Ed looked at me and he did exactly the same, and he says, Bob, you're the first man that's ever cleaned his glasses like I've done for a lifetime. And it seemed to me it was so funny. And thereafter, I always waited for Ed to clean his glasses in a meeting with his flannel shirt flaps.
Oh, wow.
I was not going to guess that's what your memory was. I'll tell you that right now.
But that's so much better.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of interesting to talk to young people today, knowing that some of the stuff I designed is like a half a century ago. And it's kind of satisfying from the standpoint that, yes, some people saw it when it was running, and then some people are very aware that it's a historic thing, and they get a lot of joy to take a look at it. So it's, in a way, it's satisfying, but the other side of me says, yeah, the idea was right to begin with. Sure it has endurance, yes. I have my own view of the multi-billion-dollar industry today of theme parks, not just nationally, but worldwide, because Walt started the WED Enterprises company in mid-1952. I was asked to join in late 1954. So the company was barely a year and a half old, and it was basically a few guys making drawings, working along with Walt, and nobody at that time could have walked up and says, hey kid, pay attention. In 60 years, it'll be a multi-billion-dollar worldwide business. So it's kind of interesting to say that, yeah, I remember when it was just a couple of rooms full of some goofy people and a Walt Disney, not knowing we were launching a vast business. Many people ask me, they say, why did you leave Disney? Well, it was simple. I insulted the chief engineer and he fired me. Because at some point in time, Disney changed. They became more business-like. They became more regulatory in a way. And if you weren't a trained, licensed engineer, you were not allowed to design anything. So I was told I'm not allowed to design anything anymore on top of all the stuff that I designed. And it was I was unhappy days. And then I had a dispute with the chief engineer over how the mechanical guys we should talk to them and have them show us what's wrong so we can always improve things. And the chief engineer did not like the idea of mechanics telling his engineers how to design anything. So we disagreed, and the disagreement meant I was fired. And within 2 weeks, I was the president of the Gurr Design Incorporated Company, and lived happily thereafter for 20 years of doing jobs for every kind of competitor to Disney. And it led to, frankly, some of the most fun jobs I ever did, such as a 30-foot tall animated King Kong, a 30-foot tall T-Rex for Steven Spielberg in Jurassic Park, a sinking ship in Las Vegas, flying saucer for the closing ceremonies of the Olympics in Los Angeles 1984, on and on and on with every kind of crazy job, and every one of them was so much fun, and you learn so much on every job, even stuff I didn't know anything about. Michael Jackson wanted a special custom lighting equipment for his Victory Tour. I don't know anything about rock and roll. I don't know anything about touring shows, but I was willing to learn. So by getting the job and doing it, I was able to learn. All the other jobs were just like that. Everyone was different. I got to learn through every one of them. So I think it was a blessing that I got fired from Disney.
What do you think is the legacy that Aero left on this industry?
Aero Development was so instrumental in the start of, let's say, the Disneyland era, which actually started the whole theme park industry. So Aero, in parallel with Walt Disney, those two literally were at the starting point of what we would call a modern, thorough theme park. Not crummy little local parks, not little carnivals or anything like that. So those two companies grew in parallel, and both went on to very, very big achievements. Both, let's say, from the business side, the number of attractions they would build, but the constantly improving engineering and teaching themselves how to do even bigger and better attraction and design details, production, all of those details which an industry needed. It'd be hard to believe an industry got started that worked so well if those two guys weren't together doing it.